Good morning or afternoon or evening to everyone. As we celebrate the church's anniversary, I thought it would be interesting to read a few poems that were written by Reverend D.O. Parker in 1897. And they were written, one was written about Reverend William Chipman, the first pastor, as we know. And then also the other one was for Reverend Edward Manning Saunders, who took over the pastorate from William Chipman. So here we go. The first one is about Reverend William Chipman. It says, "The first and the greatest in labor and age was Chipman the pastor, the preacher and sage. With coals from the altar his spirit was fired. Silo he drank and his heart was inspired. In wisdom he sounded the trumpet of God, and people were wakened at home and abroad. The schools of this valley of which you are proud are fruits of the planting his wisdom endowed. He fused to his preaching two wonderful links, refinement in manners and temperance in drinks. A warrior in battle and steward of grace, he finished his course and gave Saunders his place." And now this one is about Saunders. "In ardor of love and the vigor of youth, he wielded with power the spirit of truth. Profound in his teaching and prudent withal, he suited his words to the great and the small. And now in his age with much prudence he wears the weight of 2 Ds, which in honor he bears." I hope you've enjoyed these, and take care.
For today's history tidbit, as we continue to think about God's faithfulness to Berwick Baptist Church for these last 192 years, I want to introduce you to two important characters. The first is the Reverend Edward Manning, and I have a couple photos of him for you here. This is the Reverend Edward Manning. He was born in 1766 in Ireland, and 3 years later with his family, they crossed the Atlantic and made their way to our neck of the woods. Edward Manning lived until 1851, and in his long life he had a very significant impact on the life of our own denomination, the Baptist denomination here in the Maritime Provinces. It's really hard to overestimate just the significant impact that he had on our denomination. A few years ago, there was a little booklet that was released by the Acadia Center for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies, all about the life of the Reverend Edward Manning. And in this little booklet, the author gives some interesting facts about Manning's life. For example, he says in 1831, after 40 years as a preacher and 20 years before his death, Edward Manning himself calculated that he had already delivered 9,252 sermons, traveled 50,000 miles, attended 457 conferences and church meetings, and another 40 church councils, baptized about 500 adults, ordained 25 ministers, and preached at 176 funerals, having married 450 couples. Mind-boggling numbers to think about. And he still had 20 years to go. The author of this little booklet goes on to say, in time he became the most important Baptist minister in the Maritime Provinces in the first half of the 19th century. He was involved in virtually every aspect of the denomination's growth and development. His influence was so great that he became known to regular Calvinist Baptists as one of the fathers, a father of our own denomination. And so you might wonder why I introduced you to the Reverend Edward Manning. Well, the reason I introduced you to him is because for many years he was the pastor of the First Cornwallis Baptist Church. And the Berwick Baptist Church was originally known as the Second Cornwallis Baptist Church. And so people in this area actually would travel up to the First Cornwallis Baptist Church located in Cunard. And so they would travel there, which in those days was really quite a journey. And stories are told of how they would actually wear their older clothes and carry with them their Sunday best and put them on as they got closer. And so it was quite a journey. And it was realized that a church was needed in these parts as well. And so 50 members were dismissed from the First Cornwallis Baptist Church, and that made up the initial membership of what would be called the Berwick Baptist Church, but then was known as the Second Cornwallis Baptist Church, which came into existence the 9th of January, 1828. And that brings us to the second character that I wanted to introduce you to, and that is the Reverend William Chipman. And so here's a photo of the Reverend William Chipman, the first pastor of our church, then the Second Cornwallis Baptist Church, known now as the Berwick Baptist Church. I wanted to read to you what an old article from the Berwick Register of 1928 had to say about the Reverend William Chipman. It says this: the Reverend William Chipman was ordained the first pastor March 19th, 1829, and continued as its pastor for 29 years and 6 months, at the end of which time its membership had increased to 352, he having baptized 428. And so in 30 years, the membership had gone from 50, an original 50, to 352, he having baptized 428. Pretty amazing to think about. And so I wanted to introduce you to these two characters to show you that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and to also show you how God has used Berwick Baptist Church in the past to encourage you that God will use us in the present, that God will use us as he continues to advance his kingdom right here in Berwick, that God still has work for us to do right here in Berwick, and he will use us in the present to see his kingdom advance. And so we stand on the shoulders of giants, and I hope that you're encouraged to see how God has used us in the past and how he will use us in the future as well. And so I hope that this little history tidbit encourages you. God bless.
As we continue to celebrate our church's anniversary, I thought I would just share some of the encouragement that I received when this last semester I was doing an archival research project on Berwick Baptist Church. And so the periods, I mainly looked at 1950s and 1960s, but I was able to review the records right from the very beginning of the church. And what I found was I was surprised, because I had never done this type of project before. I'd never looked into the history really of any local church, and what I found was just absolute devotion given to Christ, given to the gospel, and also given to the building of Berwick Baptist Church, of a place where people can gather and worship, and also a devotion to the sharing of the gospel. And I was so encouraged, but also humbled by really the legacy that we are now a part of, right? We're holding a church that has been handed to us, that's been flamed since 1828, and it is really kind of a special thing for us when we look at what our church has been and is being, and God willing will continue to be. And I just thought that I would share that with you, and remind us that we've really come from wonderful roots of Christians who have been very intentional in fulfilling the call that God had put on their life. And I guess it's my prayer that we would continue to do that we would take that torch, and really that we would carry it with vigor, with pride, and really with humility, because it's just so wonderful what our church has been and what it continues to be. And if any of you haven't looked into the history of Berwick Baptist, I really encourage you to do so, because I really think you will be encouraged as I was. In today's video, I wanted to talk about a crusade for Christ that took place during the Easter season of 1957. And this was facilitated or organized by Reverend Davison and a large committee. And the sermons that took place during this time were led by Morris Rowland Lovesey, who was the biblical literature professor at Acadia at that time. And this was a county-wide crusade for Christ. So there were other churches in the area that were participating in it. But as I read through some of the archives, could see that Berwick Baptist was really involved, and they had just a time packed full of events and things that took place. So the crusade itself took place over a 10-day period where there were sermons, almost daily sermons. There were worship evenings. There were prayer meetings. Bible classes were done. On the weekends, we had the full worship service as we would expect. There was a guest night, which was intentional for inviting people who may not know God or come to church. And so that evening was, the focus was evangelism. And there were many youth events, large youth events with big numbers, spiritual retreats, and just an amazing amount of stuff took place in those 10 days. And now, even leading up to those 10 days, there was 8 weeks of what they called cottage prayer meetings. And these prayer meetings, at least in the archives, it shows that there was about 8 prayer meetings a week. So they were very, very intentional in praying for revival, praying for a harvest, praying just that God would move during this time. And what I think is so amazing is, I know for myself, when I hear crusade, I think of war, right? And I think of perhaps some of the areas where the historical church has not done well to promote the name of Jesus Christ. So it was very interesting when I read that they had held this crusade for Christ, and I guess it reminded me of really just the importance of intentionally going out and moving and working with God to win people for God. And as I read through some of the documentations and just because there are lots of news articles, they were posting in the news as often as they could about what was going on, the events, what was to be expected, and just the hope that people would come up and would interact and would respond. And as I read through all that, I was just greatly encouraged by the intentionality that really this church, the church that we are a part of, the intentionality that they had and took on in just trying to help evangelize the area, bring the good news, bring the gospel to those who are next door to us. And it's just a wonderful thing to read about, and as I've said, very encouraging. So again, a crusade for Christ in the late 1950s, and it was a great success.
For today's history tidbit, as we continue thinking about God's faithfulness to Berwick Baptist Church for these last 192 years, I want to introduce you to someone else. In a previous video, I introduced you to the Reverend Edward Manning, as well as the Reverend William Chipman. But in this video, I don't want to introduce you to a former church member or to a former church pastor, but rather I want to introduce you to someone who we know was at the church and spoke at the church on a special celebration of an important milestone in the life of our church. But before I introduce that person, I want to set the scene. From what I can tell, it would seem that the Berwick Baptist Church has quite the legacy of celebrating important milestones in the life of the church and doing it in excellent fashion. And so we have a Berwick Register article from June 1928 that tells all about the celebrations of the 100th anniversary of the church. And so you'll remember that the church was founded in 1828. And so in 1928, in June, they celebrated the 100th anniversary of the church. And it seemed like it was quite the event. Various Baptist ministers from all across the province spoke. They had a morning and evening service. They had a banner that was prominently displayed that said 1828, Centenary, 1928. And one of the guests that was there was the Dr. F.W. Patterson, the then current president of Acadia University. And so it was quite the event. And then if we fast forward a few years, in 1958, they celebrated the 100th anniversary of the building of the current house of worship. And so the current house of worship, the one that we actually still worship in, at least part of that, it was added to over the years, of course, but that was built in 1858, and so the 100th anniversary of that was celebrated in June of 1958. And on that occasion, there was various events, but they also published the Berwick Baptist Church history, and this was done under the direction of the Reverend Davidson. And then they also put out a little souvenir booklet as well. And so, again, quite the event. There was a photo, and one of the guests at that event as well was the then current president of Acadia University, Watson Kirkconnell. And so these were important events, special events, as they celebrated important milestones in the life of the church. And so I just want to back up to June 1928 in this Berwick Register article. One of the people who were present for that celebration, and I'll remind you that the pastor at that time was the Reverend Allaby. One of the people that was present for that and actually spoke was the Reverend Dr. John Howard MacDonald. And that's the person who I want to introduce you to. And so on the occasion of the 100th celebration, the 100th anniversary of the Berwick Baptist Church, the Berwick Register article says that the Dr. John Howard MacDonald, then pastor of Wolfville Baptist Church, stated he was glad to have part in so notable a service. He said the contributions by this church in 100 years of service could not be estimated. So much had been given to the integrity of the community, to the educational and social life, no less than the spiritual life. And so we know then, on one of the Sundays in June, at the evening service, the Reverend Dr. John Howard MacDonald was present and spoke in the current sanctuary that we still worship in, which I think is pretty awesome. And so John Howard MacDonald is quite the figure from our own denomination's history. A few years back, I was able to be part, actually, of putting out an ACBAS booklet, the Acadia Center for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies, that tells all about the life of the Reverend John Howard MacDonald, known by some as the Cardinal. John Howard MacDonald is a fascinating character. He was born in 1863 in Cape Breton, and he served various pastorates over his years in prominent churches, Amherst Baptist Church. He served at the Fredericton Baptist Church, as well as serving as the pastor of the oldest continuing Baptist congregation in Canada, the Wolfville Baptist Church. In addition to that, he also served as a chaplain during the First World War, which of course for me is quite significant because my wife Kayla serves as a chaplain, as a padre in the Canadian Armed Forces. And so John Howard MacDonald served during the First World War. He was over in Europe with the troops, and he was able to rise up to the rank of lieutenant colonel, which is a significant thing in and of itself, but particularly significant given the time in which John Howard MacDonald lived. And so he's a fascinating character, and I wanted to introduce you to him because we know that he was at the church on a particular Sunday in June 1928. I want to tell you one little story about John Howard MacDonald, as well as read you a poem that he wrote. And so one story is told in this little booklet written by Roger Prentice about when he was pastor at the Fredericton Baptist Church. And so Roger Prentice, the author, says this: one story recorded in a recent history of this church, the Fredericton Baptist Church, concerns their baptistry, which was, at that time, located beneath the floor of the pulpit. Imagine that. One Sunday, MacDonald, forgetting that it had been opened for some reason, stepped back and fell into the water, successfully delaying the service whilst he quickly retreated to the parsonage for dry garments. And so, quite a story, fell right back into the baptistry. I want to also read you a poem that he wrote while he was in Amherst, while he was pastoring at Amherst, and it's called Build Higher. And it says this: I saw a bird on a tree. 'Twas when springtime came with its shower, and sunshine and fragrance of flower, and it built its nest near the earth, the birthplace of gladness and mirth. The thought of a serpentine foe, lying hidden in ambush below, never entered that innocent breast, as it sang and builded its nest. 'Tis no fanciful picture I see of a desolate nest in that tree, so I call till my voice gins to tire. Sweet songster, build higher, build higher. I saw a youth start in life. 'Bout his path there were clusters of flowers, leafy shade and sequestering bowers, and he said, here I'll build me a nest, and when weary I'll hie me the rest. Surely this is the paradise place for all who succeed in the race, never dreaming the spoiler lay near, mid scenes so delightfully dear. Like the desolate nest on the tree, a life wrecked and saddened I see. So my word to all youth is aspire, build the nest, build higher, build higher. And so there we have it then. We know that on an evening in June 1928, that the Reverend Dr. John Howard MacDonald, a significant character in the history of our denomination, was at our church in the sanctuary and actually addressed the congregation at that time. A pretty fascinating little bit of history, a little bit of a tidbit of our own Berwick Baptist Church history. God bless. And so we hope that these little history tidbit videos have been a blessing and an encouragement to you. There's a new song that we've been singing lately called Faithful Now. And the whole lesson of that song is to show us how God has been faithful in the past and he will be faithful now. And so we hope that these little history tidbit videos have given you a glimpse into some history of the Berwick Baptist Church and has shown you how God has been faithful in the past and to encourage you that he will be faithful in the present as well and on into the future. Our address is no accident. You and me are here at this time for a reason. God has us here. There is work for us to do. And so I hope that we will get on with the work that God has for us now, and that you are encouraged that he, just as he's been faithful in the past, he will be faithful to sustain us and empower us in the present as well. And so let's get on with the good work that God has for us to do right here in Berwick. God bless each of you.